Nathan Cooley Keep, a Boston dentist, spent part of the autumn of 1846 fitting a set of false teeth for George Parkman, and he kept the plaster cast of the jaw afterward. 3 years later, a furnace burned George Parkman down to fragments, and the cast in Keep's cabinet was the only thing left that could say whose fragments they were. Parkman was 56 that autumn. He had been born on Beacon Hill in 1790 into one of the wealthiest families in the city, and he lived on Walnut Street with his wife and their 2 children. He was very tall and very thin, his jaw pushed forward in a way people remembered, and he wore a stovepipe hat. He had been trained as a physician and had not practiced for nearly 30 years. Keep took a wax mold of the lower jaw, made a plaster cast from it, fitted the plates, and cut an inscription into the mold, recording that the work had been done for this patient and no other. Then he put it away. The Parkmans belonged to the narrow set of Boston families that had made large fortunes and were still making them, and a set of teeth for a man of that class was ordinary work. On Friday, the 23rd of November, 1849, Parkman went out on his usual round through the West End. He did not come home. He was 59 years old by then, and worth something in the neighborhood of $500,000. Much of it was ground and buildings, a great deal of it small tenement housing on the low-lying land in the West End that his father had bought up before him, and the rest was money out on loan. Other men in his position sent an agent to knock on those doors. Parkman kept no horse. He could have kept a stable of them without feeling the cost, and instead he went himself, on foot, in all weathers, calling at his own properties and collecting his own rents in person. This case survives because a dentist did not throw away a piece of plaster, and we build these episodes out of what people happen to keep. Subscribe and stay with them. The regularity was the part people commented on. His neighbors said the sight of that thin figure hurrying past was reliable enough to set a watch by, and one Boston paper had taken to calling him the pedestrian, as though the walking were a profession. That was the man Boston recognized in 1849. The height, the hat, the pace, the ledger. He had not always been that man. He had entered Harvard in 1805, at 15. He was a sickly child, and the sickliness was what had turned him toward medicine in the first place. He delivered the salutary oration in 1809, then went to the University of Aberdeen for 2 years and took his medical degree there. Then Paris. He crossed to Europe aboard the USS Constitution and was introduced through Benjamin Thompson to Joel Barlow, the American minister to France. He did his graduate work at the Pitié-Salpêtrière under Philippe Pinel and Pinel's younger colleague, Jean-Étienne Esquihol. And what he saw there was the treatment of the insane by men who considered them patients. He was in his early 20s. He had crossed an ocean to stand in that hospital, and one sentence of what he thought of it survives. Writing home, he described his first sight of the place as coming with the high privilege of the guidance of its great physician. Pinel, he added, received him kindly. He came home to the United States in 1813, into a country at war, and took a commission as a surgeon in a regiment of the 3rd Brigade of the Massachusetts Militia. By 1817, he had written it down. He produced 2 papers, one on insanity and one on the management of the insane, and in them he set out what he had watched working in Paris. An asylum should be arranged like a residence rather than a ward, with patients who kept hobbies, kept company with one another, and took a hand in the running of the household so far as each of them was able. Then he went to the trustees of the Massachusetts General Hospital. There ought to be a hospital for the insane connected to the general one, he told them, and he wanted to supervise it. He offered to raise $16,000 toward building it at full size. He was 27. The trustees had his papers and his offer in front of them. They read the offer as a promise to endow the entire institution, which was not what he had said. the misunderstanding went unrepaired. When the asylum was eventually established at McLean, the trustees declined to appoint him to it. Their reasoning was that the appointment would carry the taint of corruption if the man holding it had paid for the place himself. They gave the post to Rufus Wyman. Parkman was not yet 30 years old, and the thing he had trained for in Aberdeen and Paris and set down in 2 papers was now going to be done by somebody else. Rufus Wyman had a son named Jeffries, who became an anatomist. 32 years later, Jeffries Wyman would be standing over what was left of George Parkman. Parkman gave up medicine. Not the interest in it, only the practice. He went on visiting the patients at the asylum and entertaining them, and when cholera and smallpox came through Boston, he opened houses of his own for the treatment of the sick. He never practiced medicine again. By the 1840s, the daily circuit through the West End was the thing people knew him by, and there were 2 ways of describing it. Oliver Wendell Holmes described it as discipline. He abstained while others indulged, Holmes wrote of him. He walked while others rode. He worked while others slept. Fanny Longfellow, writing to a friend, called him the lean doctor and the good-natured Don Quixote. Richard Henry Dana, Jr. remembered the same man and the same walk differently. Dana recalled a physician of wealth and high social position who owned a great many small tenements, and noted that hard things had been said about his strictness in collecting what he thought his dues. Dana then added that his own memory of the man was of ready and active benevolence, and left both statements standing. Holmes held a professorship at the Harvard Medical College that Parkman had endowed, and his description comes from a memorial lecture delivered in November 1850, a year after the killing, in a case where he had also appeared as a witness for the prosecution. The portrait of a hard creditor pressing a debtor was of direct use to the defense of the man accused of killing him. No description of George Parkman survives from anyone who had nothing at stake in how he was remembered. The walk that Holmes offered as proof of a good character was the same walk the defense would offer as provocation. His father, Samuel, died in 1824. Samuel Parkman had bought up low-lying land and income property in the West End, and out of 11 children by 2 marriages, he had picked George to administer the estate. Now George took complete control of it. What he did with it was buy. He bought land and real estate across the city, a good deal of it poorly maintained tenement housing, and he put money out at interest. He also sold ground. The Charles Street Jail was built on land that came from him, and near the Charles River, beside the Massachusetts General Hospital, a new building went up on North Grove Street for the Harvard Medical College. Its basement held private laboratories for the professors, a dissecting room where students worked on cadavers, a furnace, a vault beneath a privy for anatomical waste, and quarters for the janitor and his wife. It opened in 1846, in the same autumn that Keep was fitting Parkman's teeth. John White Webster was born in Boston in 1793, 3 years after Parkman, into the same narrow world. His mother was a Leverett, out of one of the great Harvard families. He graduated from Harvard College in 1811, completed his medical training there 4 years later, and then went out to the island of St. Michael in the Azores. He practiced medicine on the island, wrote his first book about it, and met Harriet Hickling, daughter of the American vice consul there, a merchant in wine and oranges. Webster and Harriet married in 1818 and had 4 daughters. Back in Boston, he tried private practice and could not make it pay. In 1824, he was appointed a lecturer in chemistry, mineralogy, and geology at the Harvard Medical College, and about 3 years after that, he was promoted to the Irving Professorship. The salary reached $1,200 a year, and out of it, by the custom of the time, he paid for the materials of his own demonstrations. His debts ran to more than twice his yearly salary. He and his family had built a mansion in Cambridge and lost it. And by 1849, they were leasing a respectable but not grand house from a man named Jonas Wyeth. He had borrowed from friends. According to one account, he had put his mineral cabinet up as security against more than one loan, including a loan from Parkman's own brother-in-law. The two men had known each other since boyhood. The Reverend Francis Parkman, George's brother, was Webster's Unitarian pastor. On the 19th of November, 1849, Parkman came to the medical college and demanded payment. The janitor, working nearby, heard him do it. 3 days later, he went out to Cambridge looking for Webster and did not find him. Instead, he called on the college cashier, a man named Petty, and asked him to hand over the receipts from the sale of Webster's lecture tickets and put them against the debt. Ticket money was the nearest thing a professor had to a wage. On the morning of Friday, the 23rd, Webster came to the house on Walnut Street and proposed that they meet at the medical college that afternoon at 1:30. Parkman spent the rest of the morning out collecting, as he did every day. One account says his wife expected him back at 2. He dressed that morning in a dark frock coat and dark trousers, and under the coat a waistcoat of purple satin. He was 59 years old. That is what he was wearing when he was last seen. It was known around the city that he was in the middle of a number of financial transactions and that he carried money on him. A witness later placed him on the steps of the college early that afternoon. At 1:45, he was seen going in at the North Grove Street door. The building he walked into had gone up 3 years earlier on ground that had come from him. Nothing was recorded of what happened next. There were no witnesses, and every account of the following hour was produced later by someone who had a reason to give it. He was not seen again. The family went to the police on the 24th. By the 26th, a reward of $3,000 had been settled on for finding him alive, and 28,000 copies of a notice were printed, posted, and handed out across the city. A further 1,000 was offered a little later for his body. City Marshal Francis Tuckey had the Charles River and Boston Harbor dragged and sent men out to the neighboring towns. Search parties went out day and night. Officers searched the buildings Parkman owned, the ones he rented out, and empty buildings he had nothing to do with. Boston at that moment supported 120 periodicals, and the first suspicion in the city fell on its Irish immigrants. Tuckey's officers searched the medical college as well. They gave particular attention to the laboratories and to the dissecting vaults, and they found nothing. They came back and searched it a second time and found nothing again. Ephraim Littlefield was the janitor there. He and his wife Caroline lived in the basement. On the 29th of November, which was Thanksgiving Day, he borrowed a hatchet, a drill, a crowbar, and a mortar chisel, and began cutting through the brick wall of the vault beneath the privy. He got through 2 courses of brick in a little over an hour, stopped for the evening, and came back the following day to finish. On the 30th, he broke through and found human remains. The next day, they emptied the furnace in the laboratory. Among what came out of it was a jaw, with teeth still in it. A coroner's jury was assembled that same day, the 1st of December, under the coroner Jabez Pratt. Before the jurymen were let in, the coroner and the marshal's men went over the rooms themselves. They examined a sink that had recently been gouged in several places, and stains on the floor and on the steps that later testing identified as copper nitrate, a substance used for taking out blood. Out of the furnace, along with the jaw, came a button and some coins. Later searches of the rooms turned up blood-stained clothing. Remains had now been recovered from 3 separate places inside one building. They were brought together and laid out on a board, and the medical men went to work on them. Jeffries Wyman, the anatomist, was brought in for the bone fragments. His father was the man who had been given the post at McLean 32 years earlier. The parts were laid out, tested, and described in writing. And the conclusions were that they belonged to one body, that the body was male, that it had not been dissected for any anatomical purpose, and that the man had stood about 5 feet 10 inches. George Parkman had stood about 5 feet 10 inches. Then they sent for Mrs. Parkman. She and her husband had been married long enough to have 2 adult children, a son and a daughter. And for a week, the city had been handing out notices about her husband in the street. What she was asked to do was look at what had been laid out on that board and say whether it was him. She said it was. She identified him by marks on the body that a wife would know and a stranger would not. Her brother-in-law was asked separately and confirmed it by a physical particular he had seen in life. The search had taken 7 days. On the 21st of March, 1850, in the 3rd day of the trial, a Boston dentist carried a plaster cast and a wax mold into a courtroom and set them down where the jury could see them. The court had already spent 2 days on a single question, and the question was not who had killed George Parkman. It was whether the thing found in the basement of the Harvard Medical College was George Parkman at all. Under the law of Massachusetts, the prisoner could not testify. The doctors called so far had been careful men, and several of them had conceded, under examination, that they would not have recognized the remains as belonging to anybody in particular. The day before, the jury had been taken to the college and had gone down into the vault themselves. The same day, Oliver Wendell Holmes took the stand and told the court that whoever took the body apart had known anatomy, that a wound between the ribs would not necessarily produce a great deal of blood, and that the build of the remains was not dissimilar to Parkman's. Not dissimilar was as far as he would go. Nathan Cooley Keep was sworn next. He was asked about the jaw that had come out of the furnace, and he said the teeth had been brought to him and that he had known them at once for the ones he had made, over which he had taken so much trouble 4 years before. There could be no mistake about them, he said. Then he showed the jury. He took the burned jawbone and fitted it into the plaster impression of a living man's mouth, and it went in exactly. He broke down in front of them. While he was still on the stand, a fire alarm began ringing from the building where the Attorney General had left his belongings, and the court adjourned so that he could go and fetch them. 60,000 people passed through that courtroom over the 12 days of the trial, by one count, admitted in short shifts and turned out again. When the court came back, Keep took up the loose teeth from the furnace, showed how each of them sat into his own plates, and wept again while he did it. He steadied himself, turned the mold over, and showed the inscription he had cut into it 4 years earlier, which said whom the work had been made for. That afternoon, the defense called William Morton, who was also a dentist. If the jawbone were set among a dozen others that he could produce himself, Morton said, nothing about it would lead him to pick it out. He took several artificial teeth of his own manufacture, teeth made for other mouths, and pressed them into Keep's mold in front of the court. They fitted smoothly. Other medical witnesses for the defense, some of whom had already appeared for the prosecution, allowed that identifying the body was difficult and that the cause of death was harder still. The prosecution brought 3 dentists in rebuttal, and the substance of all 3 was that a craftsman recognizes his own work. The mold that could only ever have been made for one man in the world had accepted another man's teeth the same afternoon, in the same room, in front of the same 12 people. George Parkman was buried on the 6th of December, 1849. Thousands of people stood along the streets of Boston to watch the funeral go past. John White Webster was convicted on the 30th of March, 1850. In June, he wrote a confession saying that Parkman had come at him over the debt, that he had picked up a stick of wood and struck him once on the side of the head, and that there had been no second blow. He was publicly hanged on the 30th of August, 1850. In 1971, Robert Sullivan, chief criminal prosecutor for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, read the whole documentary record of the case and published his conclusion that the verdict had been unwarranted. The family moved to a house at 33 Beacon Street and shut the door. They lived there as recluses. Neither of the two children ever married. Parkman's widow died in 1877, and her given name is not preserved in any account of the case. According to a single source, she was the first person to put money into a fund raised for the wife and 4 daughters of the man convicted of killing her husband. The daughter, Harriet, died in 1885, having lived in that house for 35 years. The son, George Francis, died in 1908. By one account, he had spent his life believing that his father had been presented at the trial as an avaricious and bullying man, and he left the Beacon Street house and an estate of nearly $5.5 million to the city of Boston. A descendant of the family said long afterwards that they never recovered, and that the Parkmans very nearly went out of the city altogether. The plaster cast of the lower jaw and the wax mold that Nathan Cooley Keep made in the autumn of 1846 are still in Boston. They are held in the collection of the Countway Library, and they are put on display from time to time. They are the only part of George Parkman that survives. He had once offered to pay for a house where the insane could keep their own occupations and their own company.